Can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Try and channel it.
Free and uncorrupted communication.
Hello, I'm Sheridan Blau, Director of the South Coast Writing Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we're here today for what we think is a really historic moment. It's a moment when we have on our campus and in visiting our writing project at one time, three of the pillars of modern composition research and development. Three people, if you asked anybody who's, I think, an expert in composition to name 4 or 5 people who had more influence on what happened in the field of composition in the past 50 years than anyone else, I think these names would appear on every list. The fourth would be there'd be a lot of argument about who the fourth would be, but everyone would agree that these three ought to be on the list. And so we thought we'd take advantage of this opportunity by having our three guests talk about composition research for the past 40 years, past 2 generations or so, and tell us what they think we've learned about how writing is taught and learned, how it's best taught and learned, and what the sources of our knowledge are, what's the basis of our knowledge, and how authoritative is our knowledge. And that's the basic question that we're going to put to our 3 panelists, whom I'll introduce right now. Our first is Charles Bazerman, who is a professor of education, has just finished a term as chair of the Department of Education at UC Santa Barbara. And I'll read this so I don't mess it up, I won't get it too wrong. Charles Bazerman is one of the world's leading scholars on writing across the curriculum, writing in the academic community, and genre theory. He is widely regarded as the leading American authority on research methodology and the history of research and composition, and is the senior editor of the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Research in Composition and Rhetoric. His award-winning book, Shaping Written Knowledge, the Genre and Activity of the Experimental Article in Science, is regarded as a seminal study by scholars throughout the world. His more recent books include The Languages of Edison's Light, a study of how intersecting discourses foster and produce new knowledge, and Constructing an Experience, a collection of influential articles he has written over a period of 20 years on the teaching and learning of writing and on problematic issues in rhetoric and composition. He's also the author of important books for freshman composition and a handbook in English skills, and he has teaching experience that begins in elementary school and works through college and university. He's a former professor at Georgia Tech, and he's now, as I say, professor of education at UC Santa Barbara. Our next guest is Peter Elbow, who is known to everyone in composition. Some would say he's the most influential, has had more influence on the teaching of writing than any other figure in the modern period. He certainly had a powerful influence on our writing project. He is Professor Emeritus and former director of the writing program at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Of all the living scholars in the field of composition in the English-speaking world, he has probably had the most radical and most lasting influence on the way writing is taught and practiced in colleges and perhaps in secondary schools, as well as in the National Writing Project. His first book on the teaching of writing, which followed an earlier scholarly book on Chaucer, is called Writing Without Teachers, and it's undoubtedly one of the most important contributions to writing pedagogy over the past century. Chuck Bazerman mentioned to me the other day that it was transformational for him when he read it and when it first came out, and it certainly was for me and for most people I know. His subsequent books extended his pedagogical influence and articulated a theory of composing and of pedagogy that is now generally known as what Peter objects to. It's called the expressivist school. Peter doesn't like to be identified with the expressivist school of writing, but he's certainly identified with the whole school of writing and thinking about writing. And for those people who think about writing as discovery and writing as process, Peter may be said to be the equivalent of what Darwin is to biology. His books include Writing with Power, Embracing Contraries, What is English, and Everyone Can Write Essays Toward a Hopeful Theory of Writing and Teaching Writing. And he has a new book he's working on now on voice, speech and writing. George Hillocks. George Hillocks is professor of English and Education Emeritus at the University of Chicago, where for many years he headed the MAT program in English and the English Education Doctoral program, and served as the mentor for many of the most productive researchers presently publishing in the field of English education. As a researcher in English education, he is also the mentor and exemplar for the entire field. His half a dozen books have shaped theory and have had a profound influence on practice in the teaching of writing, literature, critical thinking, and in the assessment of student performance in the language arts. He has won most of the major research awards available in the fields of English education and English studies, including the most prestigious David Russell Award. His most recent influential books include the now classic Teaching Writing as Reflective Practice, 1995, and The Testing Trap, How State Writing Assessments Control Learning, 2002. His most recent book on the teaching of narrative is just now come out from Heinemann, and a book written by his former students and intellectual heirs celebrating and documenting his powerful influence on theory and practice in English education was recently published by Heinemann under the title Reflective Teaching, Reflective Learning, How to Develop Critically Engaged Readers. George is by most people in the profession thought of as the Dean of English Education, and we're delighted to have him and all the rest here. So let me ask our panelists to start by addressing the question, what do we really know about the teaching and learning of writing? How do we know it? What are the sources? What's the basis of our knowledge, and how authoritative is that knowledge? And I'll ask Peter to start.
Well, it's a pleasure. I don't usually think in terms of what do we really know and what's the basis of it. My temperament tends to make me say what I like to be true and what do I hope is true. And but it's been very helpful for you for Sheridan gave a little bit of notice about this question. So I've tried to think from this new lens. What do we know? What's the basis of it? And I'll just make a list of things under 3 degrees of, you might say, knowing. One, a stronger basis, authoritative universals, broad claims that pertain to everybody, if you want to be ambitious, things that we can trust are true. They apply widely to humans, almost as though they're proven. There's not much reason to doubt them. So that's very high authority. Another kind of knowledge, I think, that's equally authoritative, and we can trust they're true, but their reach is very narrow. They apply only to particular instances or to particular people. So those are 2 strong forms of knowledge. And then a weaker form of knowledge, which is non-authoritative universals, things that I think are true of most people, or if I'm risky, everybody. I've tested them against my own experience in writing and in teaching, and tried out with other people, tried out with lots of students. I hear from other writers, I hear from teachers. But these are claims that I love and I have an investment in, and so I am very liable to be, I haven't tested them rigorously, and I'm very liable to be blind. There's a danger that I'm blind to counter evidence. So I'm going to start with, just because I have a very short list of claims that I think are indubitably true, but they have an extremely narrow reach. Particular. One, I was a smart, good student. After college, I had a scholarship to Oxford, and I had had a success, and I'd done a lot of writing in college and gotten good grades, and I couldn't write my papers. And I worked very hard, and I couldn't write the damn papers. That, for me, is a foundational fact. It happened. I don't think you can doubt that. Reasons? But anyway. Secondly, and then in general, as I sort of learned to write again, I discovered that I couldn't write when I tried to write everything right, and that I could write when I let myself write things wrong. That seems to me a very particular fact. Well, I mean, I think it's widely true, but I can't claim that much. Third and last in this category, there are a bunch of institutions and lots of classrooms where there is no actual quantitative grading at all. And yet, amazingly enough, teaching and learning goes on there. I taught 9 years at Evergreen State College where there was no grading at all. I've taught many classes in a conventional grading system where I didn't do grading, or else I used a grading contract. And in all these cases, not only did the world not come to an end, but most participants thought that it improved teaching and learning. So those are 3 very particular facts that I don't see how you could doubt them, but they have a very narrow reach. Now I'm going to slightly blend the 2 kinds of authoritative, stronger claims. I'm going to start with what I think of as strong universals, and then sometimes follow them with what I think is a weak universal that I happen to believe that follows from the strong one, but the things that follow are weaker. So I think it's a universal claim that our primary and usually strongest relationship with language is through speaking. Every human becomes a master of a native language of incredible complexity and order. Humans don't have to think about all this grammatical complexity to use it. And every language that any human learns from birth, if everything goes halfway decently and then not damaged, every language that a human learns from birth is complete, complex, ordered. And spoken language is linked with the body. It's not just mental. And then a weaker claim that I derive from that is that I think we do well to exploit speech in trying to learn to write. Another strong universal, people are different. And negatives, in a way, are easier to trust than positives. People are different. Teaching and learning approach that works for one person doesn't work for another. Nothing works for everybody. That seems to be indubitable. A third one, the same words cause different things to happen in different minds. Readers do not agree about the value or even the meaning of the same text. Different readers have different reactions to the same text. Another strong claim, you cannot give a valid, reliable, single number grade to a piece of writing because there are different, for many reasons, but there are many dimensions to a piece of writing, and a single number is only one dimension, and so it can't be valid. And more risky generalizations about grading follow from that, but I won't go into that right now. Another strong claim, feelings and personal relationships make a huge difference to how humans behave. So from that, the following weaker generalizations. Teaching and learning usually go better when teachers like students and students feel liked. When teachers can connect and students feel there's a human connection. For example, so they don't feel they're just learning stuff, but they're connecting. People do better when they feel supported. But I have to admit that sometimes people have become very expert at learning, at writing or anything, under what I would call horrible, inhuman, unconnected conditions. It happens. People work and learn more when they feel invested in what they're doing, as though it's part of their identity, like when they feel like I'm a writer now, I'm not just a student. Things seem to change. And when they feel that way, or when they feel they want to write, and this change in identity makes them want to write, it makes them internalize their instruction more. But again, I have to admit that people have learned to write well when they didn't give a damn about what they were writing and they didn't give a damn about the context. Another weak thing that follows, many people hate and fear writing. I mean, I think that's an interesting fact. Society-wise, a lot of people hate it. Or in addition, many people love writing. And when people start to love writing, they love it a lot, and they keep doing it all the time, and it's amazing how much they love it. And even more people, an enormous number of people want to write, whether they like it or, especially those who like it, who hate it, and those who don't write. I keep coming across people who say, I'd love to write something, and they never write. But so the desire to write is amazingly widespread, even though it's not, speaking is in our genes, it seems to be, but writing is not, and yet it's amazing how people seem to want to write. This is all about feelings, that people and human relations, that they make a difference to how people behave, but these are weak generalizations that follow from that. People do better in social conditions, with others, in groups. George was just talking about that. Unless they're so scared of others people that it shuts them down. But companionship and more points of view and interaction just is very useful if it can work. Okay, a strong claim, authoritative it seems to me, another one. Writing takes place through time. We don't just write things instantaneously. And therefore, since it takes place through time, it's possible to have a different mental orientation at different stages in the writing process. That is to say, to put it more concrete, I can spend some time thinking about the content of what I'm writing, and then I spend some time not thinking so much about the content, but thinking about the form of it or the organization. And then I can spend a different amount of time at the end, ideally, thinking about the grammar and the spelling. So we don't have to have the same mentality all the time. I can spend everybody can spend some time being sloppy and careless and accepting every idea that comes along and just being kind of open-minded and not critical at all. while they're writing something, and just write it down, anything that comes, and not being rigorous at all. And then they can change their mentality, and they can be very rigorous and skeptical and try and weed things out and be tough-minded. In other words, so it's just very crucial. The dimension of time seems very crucial, and that we have in other words, this fact that is indubitable, that it takes place through time, is a guard against any notion that there's an either-or. There's one mentality you're supposed to have. At least it's possible to have multiple mentalities while you go through the process of writing something. Similarly, reading takes, so I think that's all indubitable. People don't do it always, but it's possible. Time makes it possible. Similarly, reading takes place through time. Humans can't take in a set of words all at once. Reactions to any given sentence depends on what was read before, and it might change as different things were read before. And I've been recently interested in the consequences of how do we organize a piece of writing, given the fact that it takes place through time as opposed to being spread out in space. And I think an indubitable claim about audience. A person's sense of the audience for her words and how that audience is going to respond, whether it's writing or speaking, has a big effect on the language production. So now some weaker generalizations. I think it's usually easier to write, and we can usually find more words and thoughts when we write for a safe audience of someone who likes us and wants to hear what we say. I think that's true. I think it's also true that it helps to think about audience for our words. I mean, that's very traditional. We should try and think about who these words are going to and how to suit them. But I want to claim it also helps sometimes, very often, well, often anyway, we can take some time to not think about audience, to put audience out of mind while we're trying to write something, especially if it's a hard or scary audience. Also about audience. Teaching goes best if students write for a variety of audiences. A safe audience, an audience of peers, an audience of authority like the teacher, a non-judging audience, a judging audience, or when they're going to get judgment, when they're not going to get judgment. It helps about audience for students to have a chance for local publication like class magazines, for students to see their writing on paper in everybody's hands in a magazine. I've found that makes a difference. This is a weaker generalization, but it follows from the central importance of audience. When writing goes only to the teacher authority and only for grading, that seems to me the worst of all possible audience situations, because it's a judging audience. It makes a high stakes writing, and there's no private writing and no low stakes writing. And yet, this teacher is a person. But when it's only the teacher, the students often feel the teacher is not really a person. It's like this judge. So that's it's a common situation, especially traditionally. And yet, it seems to me a very unhappy, unuseful audience complex.
Peter,
I got to stop.
About time, if you could.
I got one more thing about audience. People don't write or learn best if the only things they write are high stakes. Learning and teaching go better with a mixture of low stakes, medium stakes, and high stakes.
Thanks. Right. We agreed to have each of our panelists give some opening remarks before they start responding to each other. I want to say one other thing before I ask Chuck to begin his piece, which is to make it clear to the people watching this that there is an audience here, and that the audience consists of about 30 teachers from the South Coast Writing Project that were in our Summer Institute, and that it's our Summer Institute of the South Coast Writing Project that brings talented, experienced teachers of writing together that brought our panelists here for this day and this occasion. So with that in mind, our viewers will recognize that our panelists do have an audience and are sometimes talking to the audience, and they'll sometimes hear from the audience. And now Chuck.
Okay. First I want to say there are many kinds of knowledge that we can have about writing, and they come from potentially many different kinds of sources. So we're actually at a point in the field of modern teaching of writing that there's been a substantial amount of what I call research, organized gathering of data from other than an unmediated personal position, let's say, and the testing of claims against that. And there are, in fact, 3 volumes that have just come out or about to come out. And one is edited by Peter Smagorinsky, which is research on composition. another is edited by Charles MacArthur, which is called Handbook of Writing Research. It comes out of a different tradition than the college composition. It comes more of the Ed Psych tradition. And then there's the book which I'm editing, the Handbook of Research on Writing, which will be coming out next year. Each is fatter than the other. And mine's going to be about 1,000 pages long. And it's all review of literature, of empirical studies, variety of kinds of empiricism, everything from ethnography through quantitative studies, through medical studies. So there's an enormous amount of things now known, a lot of things that aren't known, and many things I think that may not be knowable in that way, in principle, that cannot make its way into those books. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that first, and then move into some of the domains that there's useful knowledge for writers and for teachers of writers and learners of writing of different sorts that is more knowable in certain empirical ways. So one of the learning of writing, writing to start, is a craft and an art involving lots of local decisions, inventiveness, getting people's attention, saying something germane for situated activity. Often some kind of novelty is involved to get people's attention, to add something new to the discussion. Sometimes it isn't, but always a situational germaneness always is an important part of it. And that involves local judgments, and involves judgments filtered through your consciousness, the writer's consciousness at that time. And although you might have books on the table or stuff on your computer screen, it's got to come into your head and you've got to decide. And so that local judgment making, that kind of performance, always is going to escape the full it's in some way is going to escape anything generalizable or evidentiary, because it is a human judgment. And also it has to be, even if you're bringing other things to bear, it has to be brought through your consciousness at that point of decision. So that knowing what's in your mind and knowing how to access what's in your mind, how do you use the judgments, the intuitions, how do you deal with anxieties? There's personal management, personal psychological issues, which may in some ways be knowable, but in other ways have to be knowable as practice. And again, these things that are now clearly best known by writers who make these judgments, and by who manage their own writing processes. They know them in certain ways. And also, as teachers also, lots of local judgments, estimates of what's going on with students, evaluations of interactions, what should I say at this moment that will be most helpful, what's the right assignment for this class at this point, lots of judgments. Now those may be informed by other kinds of knowledge, but again, it's you in that classroom making that decision through your own judgment at that point. So those are important kinds of knowing which cannot be reducible to generalizations. And also, because they're kind of human craft knowledge, there's even if you could get some of the stuff in books, there's an awful lot of it which involves human contact and human mentoring. And a lot of it has to do with the performance under acting, as we were talking about recently, acting under conditions of fear without knowing what's going to happen. So there's human leadership, human mentoring is very important in learning how to have the courage to be a writer, having the courage to be a strong teacher. And so, again, these are all important knowledges. There's also experience and advice of thoughtful, accomplished writers, coaches, teachers, some of which is accessible through print and through ways that are other than just personal interaction. There are traditions of advice and guidance, some of which may be outdated, but some of it's may be very wise, or some of it may have been wise for its time and place. But there are long traditions of rhetoric, for example, that give advice about the best way to organize things, the best way to come up with things to talk about, advice about style. There's also now, though, there are these research traditions of advice, of disciplined data gathering from a whole variety of sources outside of yourself. Human judgment is involved in that, but the human judgment is exposed. The human judgment is in the making of arguments about it, and the gathering and making arguments about it, and those become also criticizable. And those force you out of what you would like to believe into seeing what things look like at a little bit greater distance from what you would like to be. Maybe I'll take another point about this. One of the things about, I will try to keep this, I will not go on too long, but writing, like any human art, almost every human activity, although there may be material constraints, is a kind of self-creating reality. So that you create a certain kind of experience, you create interactions with people around you, you create a certain kind of artistic work, and that is self-fulfilling. It creates attention, it creates forms of consciousness that go around, forms of interaction that support and continue it. So that one can develop from one's internal sense and one's self-knowledge a certain path, but there are other paths too. And that's why getting outside of sometimes people create very large paths of a very particular kind, but that doesn't mean there could be another very large path off in another different direction, and we might not gain from moving over towards that path, or getting a little bit of perspective. Then there are also things like law, policy, and reporting of events, which are also important things to know. You need to know about what state standards are, or what the assessments are, or what public attitudes are to this or that form of writing. So these are all knowable in different kinds of ways. So what's some of the kinds of things that occur now that came up in the book that I worked on, and then there are some elements, is that first, that writing is historical. It started only 5,000 years ago, as Peter mentioned. Speech is coincident with being human. Writing is very new, and its widespread is much, much newer. And sometimes just learning a simple fact about, which is known archaeologically, can change things radically. The first time I heard about Shmant Besseran's finding about the origin of writing, it was absolutely stunning to me. It's these little stones that represent a bushel of wheat, a cow. It was used for not quite sure in the beginning, some kind of animal, accounting of agriculture. They, for some reason, they need to keep the knowledge fixed, so that for a contract or a promissory note or something, so they put in a little clay ball. What's in the clay ball? Oh no, got to break it open, and then the whole historical value of it's used. Eventually they figured you could impress the little stones on the outside of the ball, and then you go, 3 bushels of wheat. Then to flatten it out, just the impression, and there you are writing. I mean, that is such a humble story about writing. It undercuts so many of our beliefs and so many of our mystical beliefs about writing. So the history of writing, the writing technologies, there's a lot known about that right now. There's also things like typography, handwriting, history of the book, authorship, large scholarly fields on that. An area which I've been very involved with is that writing has developed historically in relationship to social activities that are part that it has helped facilitate. So law is very much of a written, although you still have courtroom argument, it's mostly about filing documents, and that's very interesting long stories about that. economy is all about money is printed paper, or now it's digits. But it's all about inscription. Okay. The reason this is important for teaching and writing, because this is the reason students need to learn to read and write, to participate in a society which is saturated by inscription. You cannot participate in it unless you have high degrees of very specialized skills of inscription. Okay. Then there are all these questions about schooling. What works in school? How did schools develop around literacy practices? What works at different levels? How do we teach teachers? How do teachers come to understand what they're doing and develop further methods? I'm sure George will have things to say, very important and interesting things to say about that. Around assessment, lots of things known. Assessment is actually something we know far too much about. One thing that I have in the handbook, the one chapter, all the chapters came in long, but the one chapter that came in longest and the one that was hardest to bring down because it was so dense was the chapter on assessment. And actually they cut them so they only dealt really with the issue of validity and not reliability, and most of the literature on assessment is about reliability. So that's what we know most about. We also know a lot about how the writing and individuals, how the role writing can take in various forms of individual development, and how with a lot more to know. I don't mean to say we know it all. I'm just saying that these are areas about which things are known, including things like emergent literacy, which, again, when people start to get that was very changing for people when they realized. In relationship to the individual, I just want to point out something which some of you may know a little bit about, but again, this is stunning in that it impresses how important writing is. There have been medical studies for about the last 20 years about the medical impacts of writing journals under certain conditions. Blood cell counts improve for cancer patients, blood pressure goes down, visits of students to college clinics go down. It's very substantial that somehow it appears that writing has something to do, or can have something to do if you, with the organization of your internal neurological organization, which has something to do with your immune system. I mean, that's hypothesis. But so writing is really, really important, even at that level, as well as for the running of the banks. Okay.
That, Chuck?
Okay. Then there's a whole lot of knowledge about language and the tools of language. On the other hand, I just want to say about it's from linguistics, primarily from linguistics, but they don't capture the full story that the most skilled writers know. So you can learn a lot as a writer by studying some of the current forms of linguistics, and I know Peter has recently had some interest in that, and that sort of expands your awareness, sharpens some of your tools, but there are judgments you make about which linguistics, you can't give a good linguistic reason yet, nor can you from literary analysis. That's another source. Rhetoric has certain things to say about stylistics, but none of them encompass the full art that the strong practicing writer knows. So many forms of knowledge, many ways of getting at it.
Thanks, Chuck. George, you're going to clean up man.
I'm the cleanup man.
Yeah.
Well, I've forgotten the question. The question was...
What do we know about the teaching and learning of writing? What are the sources of our authority?
What I would like
authoritative
to do is address the teaching and learning of writing, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
I think having conducted some fairly extensive reviews of the literature on research on the teaching and learning of writing, I think that there's a lot that teachers can have access to that gives us direction for teaching. I've been, throughout my career, pretty much concerned with teaching writing at the secondary school level. For several years, I was chair of freshman English at Bowling Green State University, so I was very concerned with freshman writing at that point. But largely, with the exception of those years, I've been a secondary school person and concerned with the writing at that level. But I think there's a lot we know about teaching kids how to write, and and a lot that doesn't get used. There are a lot of beliefs, and there's a lot of lore. I think North calls it teacher lore about teaching writing that people engage in. There's a lot that goes on on the national and at the state level, but it turns out to be national because so many states have imitated the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and their writing tests that you can say it's almost a national thing. And nationally, what the research suggests is that people attend heavily to the forms of writing in their teaching, so that they teach the form of the writing. There's a heavy concern with grammar and mechanics. There's a heavy concern with how to organize a paper, but very little concern with the content. How do you develop the content? And I want to make the argument that one of the things that we do know is that when students attend to developing the content of the writing and to learning the strategies for doing that, the writing improves by most judgments, and it improves more. It improves more than with other kinds of foci for instruction. That is, when students are learning how to deal with a writing task, learning how to deal with the content engaged in that writing task, they're learning how to put language together in new ways.
And that's what you were showing this morning, right?
That's what I was trying to show this morning, right? And at the heart of that is, I believe, focusing on the particular writing task that the teacher has in mind for the students to learn. And maybe each student will fulfill that in a different way. But let's say that you want to teach something as simple as a personal narrative, and you want the students not to just write a superficial account of an experience, but you want them to write about it in such detail that any audience reading it will feel what the student felt, will see what the writer saw, and so on. Now, if any teacher here will know from experience, I suspect, that most of his or her students do not write specifically. They write generalizations, they write vague things. They say, I was really angry when my brother hit me, and so I hit him back, instead of being much more concrete about it. The problem is, how do you get the kids to be more concrete? Once you've got that identified as the strategy you want to teach, there are ways to approach it. And a lot of other things can be brought in to help with this. But once you've got the strategy identified, then the next problem, the strategy to be learned identified, or strategies to be learned identified, the next problem is figuring out a way that will enable students to do that without their being totally frustrated. I can tell them, now I want you to write specifically, but it never has worked for me. I remember my first years of teaching writing, be more specific in the margin. And then when I got the next paper, and they weren't any more specific than they had been the first time. And I was so obtuse, I guess, about it, that I just thought they weren't listening to me. Not true. They didn't know what I was saying. They were listening, but they didn't know what I meant. They didn't know what it meant to be more specific. And so you need an activity that will allow them to see how to be more specific. And it can be something as simple as this. Can I give a specific example?
Terrific.
I noticed that some point early in my career at the University of Chicago that my children, my own children, liked looking at seashells. They loved to look at seashells. We went to Sanibel Island for a vacation, and my son is holding them up, looking at, letting the sun, they're kind of translucent, and he'd see if the light came through this one, and if the light came through this, he'd look at the shapes, he'd look at the colors. It was like an endless fascination for him and for my daughter, who was older. But it occurred to me, maybe I could use seashells to get my students to write more specifically. And I use a large shell, it's about 8 inches long, called a helmet shell. And it's cream colored on the outside with kind of chocolate fudge marks at regular intervals and little dots. It's rough but smooth on the outside. One little boy in a class that was labeled as the low-level seventh grade language arts class in an inner city school felt the shell, and he said it feels all crinkly and wrinkled like an old person's skin. I thought, okay, we can go with that. But that is what, when they begin that, and they had I was pumping for metaphor. I was saying, what else does it look like? They could see in this particular shell an ear if you held it one way. If you held the opening vertically, they'd see an ear. If you held the opening parallel to the ground, it would look like a shark's mouth, they would say. I mean, we get the same kinds of responses from everybody because everybody's working from a common cultural experience. But it looked like a ball gown held with the small end up, like an athletic trophy with the small end down. It looked like an elf's cap with the small end up. And there were many different images they could derive from that. Now, this is a low-level language arts class in the 7th grade, and they're using figurative language. I didn't tell them what figurative language was. I didn't say that they had to define what a simile was or define what a metaphor was. They're using it. They're doing it. And for my money, those are similes. And they can do it, and they can continue to do it. The interesting thing is if we keep using that, well, what does that sound like? The first thing they say is it sounds like an electric mixer in the kitchen. Well, it is an electric mixer in the kitchen, but what does it sound like? How would you describe it? What kinds of words could you use? Tell me about its pitch. Tell me about its characteristics. Tell me about what it sounds like that's not it. Does it sound like a cat? No. Does it sound what? And the kids will come up with ideas. They can make up words, onomatopoetic words, which aren't words, but they're spellings of these sounds. What is a match striking on a? Do you remember? Maybe people don't even remember this, but there used to be matches that you'd light your stove with, and you struck them on the box, and it would do this little sound when it burst into flame. My son discovered that, pyromaniac that he was, and that was one of the sounds that he put on a tape for me to practice with students on describing sounds. So the kids could spell that sound. They'd make up a spelling for it, which is at the heart of poetic things. So once we get this activity invented, then we can generate more from that. And once they can describe sounds that are on the tape recording, they can go to a place and listen to all the sounds in that place. With the first class I tried this with was my own 7th grade class, and I sent them to the local mall. They had to do this after school because we didn't do field trips. But they had to go on their own to some place and listen to the sounds and try to write about the sounds. And so I have a couple examples, unfortunately not with me, that are wonderful from these 7th graders who are now adults and doing important things. But one girl described the sounds that she overheard in this little park area, garden area, in the middle of traffic on 55th Street in Chicago. It was an apartment building built in the middle of the street, so that the east traffic was on one side and the west traffic was on the other side of the apartment building. And she talked about the horns honking as bright islands of sound in a sea of gray. And she had nice imagery in there, and she's learning how to use it. And that's what we want to do. We know that works. We know that focusing on this task and helping students develop strategies for dealing with the information at hand in their own lives, maybe, in arguments about cases and problems that they can look at and see. It's got to be concrete. Then, when they do that, they learn the strategies for dealing with it. And it comes, Peter, through talk. They're first talking about it. They're saying it aloud. They're practicing. They're rehearsing for writing. And that's why I think the group discussion and teacher-led discussion, when it really is teacher-led discussion and not just recitation, When it's real teacher-led discussion, that's a rehearsal for writing. When it's real small group discussion, that's another rehearsal for writing. And those are the things, and when they put pen to paper, they've got some ideas about how to do it, and then we teach them how to revise it and make it better. There's quite a bit of research that shows that that sort of instruction is quite powerful and has large effect sizes, if I may say. Now, on the other hand, may I say on the other hand?
Yeah, sure.
We're
waiting for it.
We have a pretty good information that a lot of things in the lore of teaching don't work. One of those, and it's probably one of my favorites, is traditional school grammar. That kind of, and yet, the interesting thing about traditional school grammar is that that's the oldest part of our writing curriculum. If you think back to the Middle Ages, grammar was one of the trivium, the basis for future learning. What was grammar, logic, and rhetoric were the trivium. But grammar was first, and that was associated in the Middle Ages with magical properties. And in fact, some corrupt forms in French and in Scots
That's right.
are related to that. Glamour is related to grammar. And to glamour something is to cast a spell on it. And I like to think that teachers have been glamored by grammar for a long time. And it's difficult to pull people away from it. When I did the research for the book on the testing that you mentioned, nearly all the teachers we interviewed in 5 states, it's probably close to 300 teachers, something like 80%, 90% of them had grammar as a secondary focus of their instruction, according to their talk, according to the way we coded their talk. That's a large percentage. They were focusing on other things first, but grammar wasn't far away.
And you have evidence that that's not productive.
We have evidence that that is not productive, that it doesn't take kids anywhere, that almost anything you test against it is better.
And
In helping kids improve their writing. I think I said this morning, if you want to experiment with your newest treatment, your new ideal of how to teach writing, use grammar in your control groups, because your experimental group will certainly be better than yours. Now then, I encounter these arguments frequently from teachers, well, they have to know how to punctuate, they have to know mechanics, but they don't have to study, they don't have to parse sentences. Do you know that term, parse sentences? They don't have to say, well, this is a noun and it's in the possessive form and it's a masculine noun and so on. In the 18th century, that was what composition books did, parsing the language. Shall we
even
stop
the tradition,
there?
well, it's all right, a good place to stop. I think even the tradition of teaching grammar, if you think back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, wasn't teaching the grammar of your native language, it was teaching the grammar of Greek and Latin, a
Absolutely.
language you didn't speak.
And then it became grammar of English in the 18th century, and those grammar books are closely related to the Latin grammar books. So that you see the cases for nouns listed, they're parallel to the Latin cases, I think with the exception of the ablative. The 18th century grammar books did not use ablative. Ablative is the case that you use for objects of prepositions, as I recall.
Well, I've heard from the three of you, I think, I hope I'm not being too reductive, but I've heard 3 kinds of research that you've talked about. Peter talks about research from experience, from what we know as writers, from what we know talking to writers, and partly what we know from teaching. George talks about what we know from our teaching, what we've tested in the classroom. It's empirical. And Chuck talks about another kind of knowledge, a knowledge that seems to be more about writing in the world. And that comes from empirical research and comes from various kinds of studies. And just for the heuristic purposes, let me ask or make the statement, is it the case that the knowledge that's actually most authoritative and that gets us furthest is the knowledge that's sort of the least derived from formal research and most derived from experience and knowledge of classroom teachers from their own reflections on practice, and the knowledge that's most authoritative, that has the most weight in the intellectual community, in fact, doesn't do much good for anybody. It's knowledge about, I mean, it's wonderful to know how writing started and how how it's carried on around the world, but it doesn't, it has a certain kind of weight, but in fact, it doesn't do much good for teachers and classrooms, for people who think about reading and writing. But the knowledge that does a lot of good there seems to be sort of much less authoritative. Is that you're
I disagree.
Okay. I thought you might.
I think they interact, and maybe I'll steal George's example first, because there is the wisdom of the teacher in it, but it's a wisdom which then gets transformed through some kind of empirical evidence. Now, if you just went through through your experience and your tradition, we could all well be teaching grammar, and we'd say our students are learning and getting better at that part of it, and that would continue. But you need empirical studies to say, well, there are other paths, and the other paths are even more productive. I think this is going to get in a hobby horse, it might be a little bit more controversial here, but literacy studies have been so, in the last century and a half, so embedded in literary studies that the deepest experiences and paths we have around it are around the studies of literature. And I think, and if we didn't have studies of what goes on in the world and said this is where our students go, in fact, this is what motivates most of our students, these forms of writing require many other kinds of decisions and skills, we wouldn't be going there. We would still, it would still be literary sensibility, and the experiences that come out of that kind of world would still be absolutely dominant. And so I think there are many things, they need to interact, and as I said, your decisions as a writer are always local, situated knowledge, maybe informed by lots of other stuff. But you have to feel some confidence in what you're doing, and you have to seek your intuitions. And same way as a teacher. But if that's uninformed, I think that's very limiting.
Well, can we say then, to go in the opposite direction, that we do have a extensive body of research for about 50 years, 45, 50 years, where we've had a very active composition community doing serious research, empirical research, all kinds of studies. And that as good as that research is, and as authoritative as much of it is, it in fact seems to have had very little impact on schools or on practice, particularly as that practice is influenced by policymakers in the states, as policymakers at the national level. Because what you seem to describe, George, is that the kind of testing that goes on in schools, the kind of testing that seems to be imposed on schools by governments, by policymakers, would fly in the face of what research tells us about how students need to learn and how they might write better.
Let me, do I have time to say, to respond? I started to do that and then I didn't. But the way the tests are set up is, it looks to teachers, and even to consultants to teachers, and even to state departments of education, although they deny it, as though the best approach to teaching for the test is to show students examples of the kinds of writing they're expected to do. That's using a sample, but what you're doing is giving the kids declarative knowledge about these models. You're saying, well, if it has this form and this form and this form, then it's going to get a good score. Problem is, they may learn the form, but if they don't know how to develop the content, it's still going to be shoddy writing. Furthermore, most states, I don't know of any states that do a good job of, for example, of criteria that explicate the difference between strong and weak elaboration. It's more. If it's more elaboration, then that's better than less elaboration. But you know that, and I know that's not true. What I see in the state examples in their scoring guides is that those with more elaboration, I have a word that comes to mind that I shouldn't use on now. What's the word I want? BS. It turns out to be BS, and you don't. That's not what I call good writing. It's not. They're filling up the space. I had one supervisor tell me that what she did when the kids were taking the test in Texas, she walked around and said to the students, "Try to write some more." And remember, there was an experiment by Breiter and Scardomale. It's so early in their career. They found out that kids wrote in their writing, when they were given a prompt, about as much as they might say in what they called a conversational burst, and that if you asked them to write some more, they would give you another conversational burst, and another conversational burst, up until 3 or 4 of these prompts to write some more. The topic was on high sticking in hockey. I'm not even sure what that is, but it's apparently using the stick on somebody's head instead of on the puck.
But isn't the case that that has been researched to show that if you look for things that correlate with high grades, the most trustworthy criterion is length. That the more people write. I want to call attention, George, to your distinction that is very helpful to me between 2 forms of telling students what what you're looking for. I mean, the students say, "Well, what are you looking for?" And there's been so much attention on saying, "Well, this is the form we're looking for," and I feel kind of allergic to that, and I hate that. But you're making such a good case that that is a problem, but that it's not so much of a problem if you say, well, what I'm looking for is more evidence, or what I'm looking for is more elaboration, or what am I looking for is more attention to the explicit logic, or whatever. That we can, in a sense, we can tell them what we're looking for more productively if it's a matter of content than if it's form.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I don't want to say, I wouldn't say, I would try to avoid saying that we tell them that. I don't think telling them makes any difference, or makes very little difference. They have to be engaged in doing it.
So you want to find
And
opportunities.
you invent the activity that's going to allow them to use a specific evidence, and you say, that's what we want.
Yeah, well, so that's what I want to ask. To what extent, I agree that it's got to be engaged, learning by doing. In a way, learning by doing didn't quite turn up, it didn't turn up clearly in mine, I want to put it in, it didn't quite, but anyway, to what extent do you want to put an emphasis on the meta-knowledge? In other words, you could engage this group in doing stuff, and you could look at us and say, they are really doing this thing, but we may not quite know what it is we're doing. For instance, like we may not know we're making metaphors. And so presumably you want to then turn around and say, you know what, you're making metaphors.
Exactly.
But it's important to name it?
No, I don't think so.
No,
With
conscious
7th
of it.
graders, I say, you're using figurative language, and we want you to use that. You're making comparisons.
And doesn't activity theory play just into what they're saying? Chuck
Well,
is master of activity theory. And isn't that whole notion of activity theory a version of what George and
Well, that you're
and Peter
doing
described?
something of significance to you within groups of people who share that interest. So there is a role for explicitness when you're actually doing it, and the explicit knowledge can help you take that activity further. But it's the engagement, the serious activity that's it's hard work to write, and it takes a lot of problem solving of many sorts over many years to get it all marginally competent in it, and we often expect far too much too rapidly. And so to do that, you have to be really engaged in doing something. You just doing grammar exercises is not going to get the high level for all the other reasons that grammar might not be the best form, but that's not going to get that high level of engaged problem solving that's going to let people grow into an advanced state of this craft and art.
So,
But if it's, I mean, I'm just trying to stick up for either or. I'm a great fan of an engagement, but Dewey was the one who said, we may learn by doing, but he said, in fact, you do not learn by experience unless you reflect on experience. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of meta-knowledge, and I want to mention there was a Carl Rogers, small-scale experiment where he taught beginning psychology classes. In some classes he gave lectures and did it in the center. In some classes he just said, here's the textbook, I'm available, do whatever you want for 14 weeks, I'll figure it out. And then he would test them at the end, and the results in the test were similar for the two classes, but the ones who had this free-form thing didn't know they'd learned as much, and it was helpful for them to realize that they hadn't been learning.